Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You are tuned in for another Midnight Mirage Classic. And I just want to show some gratitude and show you some love and give you a shout out from the entire Red Stick family. And we're very, very thankful for your support. So in this video, we will review a comment that was left on a video that was published a couple of days ago. We will evaluate the question, and I will do my best to provide some answers. I want this video to be very simple and basic for the people to understand. So whether you have, an advanced knowledge on these subjects, or maybe you have a beginning knowledge on these subjects, either way it goes, we want to provide enlightenment for all those, on the quest for knowing and the quest for knowledge. All right. So the first thing that I want to use as an introduction to this video is when we're on our journey of learning, we got to understand there's a difference between what we know and what we think. All right. There's a difference between what we know and what we think. Things that we know, you should be secure on it. You should be confident on it. And you may have all the evidence you need. Things that we think, we still are investigating. We still are gathering information on it. So we should be very, very careful on how we speak on these topics. All right. And when we're in conversation or dialogue, we need to let people know that, hey, this is still an ongoing study and this is what I think. But it could be information that shows up in the future that will, we'll have to update our understanding on this particular phenomenon. All right. This is something that I do my own due diligence to, activate as well. All right. When you are a person that creates literature and you're a writer, and you put out books on history or whatever the topic may be, as I said, new information is always coming out. There are plenty of pyramid complexes and civilizations all throughout South America and Central America that no human has ever, or at least no human in the modern era, 2024, is still parts of the jungle that haven't been explored yet. All right. And there are civilizations that are still deep beneath the jungle of the Americas and throughout other parts of the world. And as time goes on, when our technology and infrastructure evolves, we'll be able to then, enter some of these areas. And when we do so, we'll learn a lot when we do it. So understand that information and learning is an evolving, ongoing process. It's not something that you want to feel like, okay, I got to the finish line and now I'm here. Learning and this quest for knowledge and this quest for enlightenment, it really is it's a lifelong journey, and it will also continue on into the afterlife as well. So in the video that we made about faith and the Isra Mirage journey into the creative darkness, there was a brother or a sister, I'm not sure, the gender of this person, but they left a pretty good comment. All right. So let's look through this comment and we'll answer the questions as we, proceed through the video. All right. So let's read the comment first. It says, "Peace, Blackbeard. Can you make a video explaining the black nobility and their connection to the melanated people in the Americas? I'm confused because some in our community say we are Moors, while others refer to the Moors as the black nobility. Are they just the, quote, dirty Moors? Also, how did the Draconians and Anunnaki fit into this, considering you mentioned they are connected to Yakub scientists in America? I need clarification because different sources are confusing me." So, there were multiple questions asked, but the first thing that I want to point out is, all over the internet in this Aquarian age that we're in, you have a lot of people not only seeking knowledge, but a lot of people distributing knowledge. And, some of us are learned and we understand and have a good grasp on these topics, but all of us are still learning. All right. So you got to be careful when you're researching information, because who knows what the intent and the objective is for a lot of these people that may be on YouTube, Google, or whatever internet site that they're on. A lot of people are really looking for attention. A lot of people are looking to just sell products. A lot of people are looking to make a cult of personality. So a lot of people have different objectives. OK, and whatever their objective is, that's That's their own. That's their own personal. That's up to the person. Myself as an individual, my objective is a multitude of objectives. The first is I'm a businessman. So if I'm providing a product, of course the product is for sale. But probably more so than that, I just have part of my genetics is really just being a teacher. So when I learn things myself, I have a good, skill set to communicate. And I can do it in a formal way, whether it be through a video or a book. So my objective is, it's a business, but it's also just the love of learning and the love of teaching. And that's really it. It's pretty much that simple. Okay. So you do want to, be able to try to gauge what is the objective of this person that I'm receiving the information from, because the quality of the information that you receive from them is going to reflect a lot of the times what the objective is. When I got into this information, when I was first hearing that we were so-called brought over from Africa and the so-called African slave trade, I had a lot of questions. And when I did my research, I was very humble. There was no ego. I didn't go in and contaminate my findings. I didn't have preconceived notions. I pretty much told myself whatever I find on this journey, as it regards to our ethnic national origins and history, I will accept whatever it is that I find. So if I went and did my research and I started coming across empirical evidence that was objective and there were multiple sources, and all these sources may have said that we were just some people naked in the, jungles of Africa and had bones in our noses, plates in our lips, and we were just swinging from vines on trees, and some foreigners came in and saved us. If that's what the real information, would have yielded, my quest for learning, if that's what would have been the result, then that's what I would have accepted. But that's not what I found. So what you see me talking about on this, whole YouTube channel is pretty much things that I found. And so now let's get into this. All right, let's start from the top down. All right. So the first question is can you make a video explaining the black nobility and their connection to the melanated people in the Americas? All right. So when a lot of us have researched, medieval European history and even before European history, you will come across a term called the quote unquote black nobility. And there are a lot of different, quote unquote definitions as to what this means. But from my findings, the term so-called black nobility is referring to the melanated people of Europa that were ruling. So the upper class, the middle class, the aristocrats, these people were ruling in Europa for over 1,000 years. Okay. Over 1,000 years. And when it comes to the people that were sitting on the throne, the emperors, the empresses, the kings and the queens of Europa, these were a swarthy complexion, melanated people. Today, here in North America or Western civilization, we use this term called a so-called black person. So you may say a so-called black man or a so-called black woman. But when you look at them, you can tell that this is the phenotypes of, what we call the so-called black American. All right. Now, our ethnic phenotype, believe it or not, is throughout the earth. OK, so you're going to find people that look like us in the Americas, Europa, Africa, the so-called Middle East and Greater Asia, Asia Minor and Far East Asia, Southeast Asia. OK, so the so-called black phenotype or the so-called Negro phenotype, this phenotype is throughout the earth. All right. So Europe had its own group of melanated people. OK, so that term so-called black nobility refers to the rulers of Europa, in particular during the medieval period. All right. So really, you can go ahead and say from 1000 AD to about, let's say, 1800 AD. All right. Even though it goes much further back than that. But when we're talking about the so-called black nobility, you're talking about rulers in Europa from 1000 AD to about, let's say, 1800. All right. And through World War I and World War II, that's when you had the final eradication of the black so-called black nobility, their mulatto children and any kind of remnant of their existence. It was wiped out, by World War I and World War II. Now, as far as what is the connection of the black nobility to the melanated people in the Americas? Well, let's stick to North America right now. Mainland North America, what we call today the so-called United States of America. The 13 colonies was founded by the so-called black nobility. All right. A lot of the Jacobite kings that were ruling in what we call Scotland, basically the so-called British Isles, that region. A lot of these men were responsible for establishing the 13 colonies. Okay. And these were melanated men. King Charles, of course, his father, King James. These men were the ones responsible for setting up the 13 colonies. And even when you had some of the melanated people from Germany come, in particular, like in the South, they also helped establish some of the 13 colonies. So the first thing that we want to point out is that the United States of America, the Continental Congress, the Continental Army, it was born out of the 13 colonies. And the 13 colonies was set up by the melanated people of Europa who were sitting on the throne. All right. Most of what you're going to read in history, some of it's correct, some of it is wrong. But when it pertains to a lot of Western civilization, a lot of the times you're going to have the ethnicity and the phenotype and the nationality of the person changed. But the history is correct in itself. So when they say something like, for example, that, like Jamestown, Virginia, all right, which is one of the early colonies. And they'll talk about, so-called Captain John Smith and how he had a marriage with the Powhatan princess Pocahontas. They'll show you pictures and they'll tell you this history, but usually they're going to show you an incorrect phenotype and ethnicity of the person. They're going to show you Caucasian people, whereas that's not true. King James and the Jacobites were melanated or so-called black people. Captain John Smith was a Scot or a melanated man from Scotland. So this was a so-called black man. And Chief Powhatan and his daughter Pocahontas, these were a copper-colored melanated people who were indigenous to the eastern seaboard of North America. So what you have here is you had a marriage or a union between indigenous melanated Americans and we'll say swarthy people from Europa. All right. Now, us here today, for example, if you are listening to this video right now and you have been labeled either as a so-called Black American or a so-called African American, us here today that are in 2024 that may have been born in the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1980s, the 1990s, the early 2000s. Basically, the majority of us that make up who is in this country right now that have a melanated phenotype or appearance. Most of us have ancestors that come from my research, two primary groups. And these two primary groups are the copper-colored indigenous American, so those that may have looked like Powhatan and Pocahontas, and some of the melanated swarthy men and women from Europa that came over to establish the 13 colonies, and they were living on the 13 colonies. All right. So when it comes to the so-called modern Black American, your ancestors are going to come from these two groups. And remember, the further you go back, the larger your ancestry is. So I think it's a little disingenuous to just say that our people may be just 100% full-blooded indigenous American. No, there's probably a mixture of both. OK, so you're going to have some melanated people from Europa that married into the indigenous American families, and they actually started to take on indigenous American culture. So you had people from Europa who came here and they saw how, the Aboriginal people here were living on the eastern seaboard and in the southeast, and how we had a lot of leisure. We had a lot of luxury. We were relaxing because this is the land of milk and honey. This is New Jerusalem, basically, or at least in biblical terms. All right. Or this promised land of abundance. OK, that's what this is here. So when a lot of the melanated people from Europa came, they wanted to assume that lifestyle for themselves because they were coming from harsh conditions. So they would intermarry into our families here. And a lot of the times it was the melanated men from Europa coming to the Americas, and they would intermarry with melanated copper colored women who were from America. All right. So that was a lot of the original unions. You had melanated men from Europa coming to the Americas, and a lot of them would procreate with indigenous melanated women from the Americas. All right. So us today, we are a product of these unions. All right. So that's what I'm saying. Like, yes, it's indigenous American, but it could be a melanated European admixture in there as well. All right. So what I want you to understand is that we have ancestors that came from two different nations, the nations of America and some the nations of Europa. So their nationality may have been different. They may have had certain cultural practices that was different. They may have had certain religious practices that were different. They had certain languages that may have been different. But as far as their ethnicity, their phenotype, how they physically looked, that was similar and probably almost the same. All right. So, yes, their nationality was different. Yes, some of their cultural practices were different. But as far as the phenotype, it was the same. Like, I'll give you an example. Let's take somebody who's a so-called Black American from Los Angeles, California, Southern California. And let's take a so-called Black American that may be from the Bronx, New York, right? Now, we know that the culture of New York and the culture of Southern California, it's going to be different. You know what I'm saying? Like, the brothers in California got their own type of music. They have certain kind of cars they like to drive. They have certain kind of dances that they like doing. And it's very, very particular to the geographic region of this country that they are from. And it's going to be different from what the brothers in New York are doing, because what the brothers in New York are doing is going to be very specific to where they come from. But what we all know is that ethnically they are the same. So you could have so-called Black people from California, but they look like so-called Black people from New York. And they may have never even been to California if they're from New York. And if they're from California, they may have never even been to, if they're from New York, they may have never been to California. And if they're from California, they may have never been to New York. But nevertheless, their phenotype and their ethnicity looks the same. So understand that human beings, we identify ourselves with ethnicity and nationality. OK, nationality is going to include your culture, language, certain practices, certain principles we have. And it's also going to pinpoint certain geographic regions of the earth that you may be from. Ethnicity can include also certain cultural practices and certain languages. But your ethnicity, or at least as far as how I understand it, it pertains to the phenotype and how the human being looks physically. You know, the structure of their head, how their noses are, the shape of their lips, etc. OK, so usually ethnicity, think about appearance. Nationality, it could be appearance, but a lot of times it's the culture and the region geographically where somebody is from. So to move on from this question, so-called Black Americans today, our ancestors were ethnically, similar, but some of them may have been from America and some of them from Europa. So that is the connection between the Black nobility and the melanated people in America. We are the byproduct or the offspring, both culturally and ethnically and nationally, of these two groups. Let's move on to the next point. So the next question is, it says, I'm confused because some in our community say we are Moors, while others refer to the Moors as the Black nobility. Are they just the quote dirty Moors? All right. Now, this is another confusing one. And I've seen this going on for quite some time now. It's been a couple of years. I first started noticing it around 2017 myself. But you have the people who understand that we are, indigenous to America. But you also have this term Moor. All right. And what does this term mean, basically? OK, now, I've talked about this in prior tapes and I elaborated on it deeply in my book, but I'm going to give you my understanding of this. OK, the term Moor refers to the ethnicity of a person or the phenotype, how somebody looks. The term Moor doesn't really denote somebody's nationality. I've seen books and literature where you've had people in Europa referred to as Moors. And I've also seen books and literature where, and pictures and images, whether it was South America or whether it was North America, Well, they will show a so-called black American, and they may be dressed like what you may call an American Indian, but they may be referring to them as a blackamoor or a blackamoor Indian. There is a picture of Chief Saturia, all right, Chief Saturia, who was one of the kings or emperors or chiefs or leaders of the indigenous people of Florida, all right? So when a lot of the Dutch, the French, when they came to the Americas in the South through Florida and the Gulf of Mexico, they came across an indigenous so-called Negroid people. And the leader of it was a man named Saturia, all right? And I got pictures of him, and, you know, I've said this before in tapes. I got somebody I grew up with who literally looks just like him. And this guy lived right down the street from me, and he's from Georgia. So Chief Saturia is a man from Florida. And if you researched his picture, they'll call it the Moor with emerald clusters. They'll refer to his picture as a Moor with emerald clusters. But if you look at the picture, what you're going to see is a so-called black man. And he's not dressed like an African. And his phenotype looks just like the people today that you call so-called black American. But they're referring to him as a Moor. So they're not necessarily, you know, maybe trying to identify his nationality. They're trying to identify his ethnicity, his appearance, and his phenotype. So as far as my understanding, the word Moor in a general sense is referring to somebody's ethnicity and phenotype. Okay. So the term Moor is almost like saying a so-called black person, a so-called black man, or a so-called black woman. When it comes to the so-called black woman, I've seen her being referred to as a Mooress, Mooress, or sometimes a Jewess, Jewess. All right. So the term Moor, as far as I'm concerned, is dealing with the ethnicity, the phenotype, and the appearance. And that person could be from anywhere on the earth. So you could have a melanated or a so-called Moorish appearing person from America, Europa, Northwest Africa, etc. Okay. Also, I want to say this. In my book, I wrote and explained to the people that in elementary school, we learned about vowels and consonants. Vowels, A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. And then you have your consonants. And we also know that vowels can be changed out, but the root word will remain the same. Okay? The vowels can be interchanged, but the root word will remain the same. So let's take this word Moor, M-O-O-R. What you need to do is, as a scholar, when you study, start looking for the word Moor, but look for the vowels interchanged, because this is going to help you keep up with, you know, this cultural word. So you'll sometimes see M-O-O-R. You'll see M-O-H-R. You'll see M-E-R-U. All right. So you'll have Meru and you'll have the word Moor. All right. Now, as far as the indigenous American and us here in America that are from mainland North America, how does this word so-called Moor pertain to us? Because, as I've said, we may have a little bit of European ancestry, but I don't consider myself a European. I consider myself an American. So how does the word Moor pertain to me as an American? Somebody that's copper colored, but that's from America. And what I came to the conclusion is that the reason why the indigenous people here are referred to as Moor sometime is two reasons. One is that the people from Europa who came here that were, you know, creating literature, they just used a general term because the people that they found here in America look similar to the ones in Europa. So they would call or refer to them as a Moor. But even stronger and even bigger than that, why I think the word is used here for us, is that in South America, which is one of the most ancient cultures and civilizations of the entire Americas, you have the legends and the stories of the Inca as it pertains to Amaru Meru. So that's A-M-A-R-U Meru. Because we also wonder, where did this word America come from? Is the word America indigenous to the West? Was the word America brought over by Europeans, some guy from Italy, and he named this place after himself? Where does the word America really come from? And to my understanding, the word America, I believe, comes from Amaru Meru. The word America I believe comes from Amaru Maru. And Amaru Maru goes back to the people of the Incas in South America. And they have a temple, various constructions, and they have, carved out on a mountain is something called the Gateway of the Gods. The Gateway of the Gods, or Amaru Maru. And when you investigate and research this story or this legend, it talks about the original people who created the American civilization that survived the cataclysmic events of what's called, quote unquote, Atlantis. All right. So when, quote unquote, Atlantis, or the antediluvian world, when the antediluvian world and those civilizations started to fall for whatever reason it was, not everyone died during those times. A lot of people survived. And the people that survived, that started to reinstitute civilization in the Americas, Amaru Maru is said to be some of these people or groups of people, or this man and his wife. All right. So you'll see Amaru Maru referred to as a chief or a priest. You'll see it referred to this chief priest and his wife. Or it collectively could be the people that survived the antediluvian cataclysmic events, and they helped to reinstitute the North American civilizations. So we're talking about the ancestors of the Olmec, the ancestors of the Maya, the ancestors of the Inca, the ancestors of the Mississippians here in North America. The ancestors of these people are the Amaru Maru, those that survived the antediluvian world. And they are the ones that started to create and construct the pyramids and the mounds across North, Central, and South America. Remember, the Aztecs, when they were approached by the Spanish in the 1500s, the Spanish were made aware that the Aztecs did not create those pyramids. So there were people there before them that created it. So those super ancient people are the Maya, the Olmec, the Amaru Maru, or the survivors of the antediluvian world. So this is where the term Amaru Maru, from my research, it comes from. It comes from the ancient Inca, all right? And it traveled up through Central America and North America. And I believe a word that was created to consolidate is America. So that's why we refer to ourselves as Americans, because the 1828 Webster Dictionary of American is a copper-colored person who was living on the land prior to the arrival of Europeans. That's basically what the definition of an American is. A copper-colored person or inhabitant of the Americas prior to the arrival of Europeans. So that means that if you descend from the copper-colored people who were in the Americas, whether that be North, Central, or South, prior to the arrival of the melanated people from Europa, prior to the institution of the 13 colonies, if you have ancestors that come from the American tribes, those ancient tribes who are already here, you are a bloodline American. Okay? You are a bloodline American. Remember, there's a difference between a United States citizen and an American. The Americans were here prior to the arrival of the United States. A United States citizen is somebody who basically got their identity after the Continental Congress and the United States of America was established by the Iroquois Confederacy and the melanated men from Europa that they were working with on the Eastern Seaboard. So me personally, I don't have a problem with Americans or United States citizens, because me, myself, I'm an American citizen. All right. And the United States was established by melanated people from Europa who wanted to create a new life. So there were foreigners involved in the establishment of the United States. So these were melanated people coming from Europa, and these were also Caucasian people coming from Europa. All right. But the melanated ones, they were in the leadership position. So they were the ones that were sitting in the Continental Congress. They were the ones that were leading the Continental Army against King George and the Redcoats. OK. So understand that an American and a United States citizen, a United States citizen basically is somebody who came from the 13 colonies when that eventually was consolidated All right. Yes, it was, changed a lot in the late 1700s and also in the 1870s. But we're basically just differentiating between an American is somebody who was already here. A United States citizen is a person who created a new life for themselves after the 13 colonies was established. Okay. So the term Moor, like when this person put, I'm confused because some in our community say we're Moors while others refer to the Moors as the black nobility. Yeah, the Moors were the black nobility, but the indigenous Americans are also referred to as being Moorish people by being the Amaru Maru or American. All right. So that's why you'll hear the word Moor being used for indigenous American people as well as people from Europa. So the word Moor doesn't just pertain to the so-called black nobility or people from Europa. Now, as far as this term, a quote-unquote dirty Moor, a quote-unquote dirty Moor is just a shady, corrupt nigga that's from anywhere on this earth. So they could be from America, they could be from Europe, they could be from so-called Africa, so-called Middle East, so-called Asia. A dirty Moor is just a corrupt so-called black man or black woman. Let me say that one more time. A dirty Moor is just a corrupt so-called black man or black woman. It doesn't matter where they are from. You know what I'm saying? They could be from Dallas, Texas. You know what I'm saying? They could be from Palestine. They could be from Vietnam. If it's an indigenous melanated person, copper-colored person that comes from the original human family, and they just so happen to have a corrupt or shady behavior and spirit, they are a so-called dirty Moor. So the dirty Moors are not only the people from Europa that came here with a colonial mindset and didn't want to work with the people and just wanted to war with the original American. Not only are they dirty Moors, but the chiefs who were indigenous to America that sold their own people out and continued to fight against other tribes that were living next to them, the neighboring tribes, they also are dirty Moors. All right. So let's understand that a dirty Moor is basically just a fucked up so-called black person. Excuse my language. All right. So moving on, the next thing. Also, how do the Draconians and Anunnaki fit into this? Considering you mentioned they are connected to Yakub scientists in Americas. All right. Now, the next thing, when we talk about this, we got to understand that when we learn about the Anunnakis and the Draconians, we're reading this from ancient books and ancient information that was written down by people who were here a very long time ago. Okay. And what I know by being an author is that when I write something in a book, I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know if I'm using symbolic language. I know if I'm being literal, etc. Okay. Now, somebody that's reading my book that didn't ask me a question as it pertains to what did I really mean by this, and they may be trying to interpret what I wrote, they may be correct, but they also can be incorrect. So whether it's the Bible, whether it's the Enuma Elish, whether it's the Book of the Dead, whether it's the Codex tablets created by the Maya, none of these books were written by people that are living today. So when we read this information and these resources, we are trying to interpret what we think that they meant. So you'll either directly, literally take what they wrote, or you'll, perceive some of it to be symbology, and then you'll come to a conclusion. Now, because this is something that we didn't write, and we don't have the person that wrote it to ask them what did they mean, that lets me know that whatever we say pertaining this or concerning this topic is something that we think. We don't really necessarily fully know. We may even be 80% correct, but we can't say we fully know because we didn't write it. And the reason why I have to give, the authors of the Bible, the authors of the Quran, and all these ancient books that we learn from today, I have to give them that respect because somebody can read the books that I've written today and they can try to say what they think that I meant, and I can hear their interpretation. I can say, no, you're wrong. That's not what I meant. And they can't tell me what I meant because I wrote it. So when we read certain stories in the Bible or whatever, you got to be very careful because the person that wrote it, you don't really know what they meant. It could either be a symbol or it could be literal. All right. Now, I said that to say I said that because we read about the Anunnaki, all right, in ancient Mesopotamian, ancient Sumerian information. We basically get this story about living beings, okay, who came from either another galaxy, or let's just say they were not local to Earth. They were from somewhere else, either another dimension, another planet, another universe. Either way it goes, they were not indigenous to the Earth, okay? The story goes that there were some beings that came from another planet or somewhere else. They came to the Earth, and that they, quote unquote, either created a being to live on this Earth. They used some of their genetics to mix with people who were living on the Earth. In other words, they came here and they set up shop. They were doing some kind of work here, and they were trying to establish something on this Earth. All right. So whether that be the so-called Anunnaki or whether that be the so-called Draconian. All right. Now, when we hear the term Draconian, most of us have an image in our mind of maybe so-called reptilian or lizard people. Now, me personally, because I've talked to you all about this before when I tried to explain what do I think the serpent in the garden is. The serpent is one of our ancient symbols of wisdom, cunning, high-level intellect, and it could be deception, okay? But does the serpent actually mean a talking snake? I do not think so. Now, remember, I did not write Genesis. So whoever wrote it, they know what they meant by serpent. They know if they really meant the symbol, and they also know if they actually meant the talking snake. But I don't have that person here to ask them. So I have to just use my deductive reasoning, my common sense, and my experience. And I think that when they talk about the serpent, they're talking about a symbol. What kind of living being was it? It could have been a serpent that was a human. It could have been a serpent that was from another dimension. Nevertheless, was it a talking snake? Probably not. You know what I'm saying? So when we hear about the Draconian, that's really no different than the Anunnaki. You're talking about basically living beings that were not from the Earth that came here. And some of them probably had good intentions, and some of them may have had bad intentions. No different than when the Europeans came to set up the 13 colonies. They were no different than like the Anunnaki or the Draconian. When they came to the Americas, some of them had good intentions. Some of them had bad intentions. Okay. So as far as whether the Draconians and Anunnaki fit into this, I'll say this. I know there is a higher power, or what we call God. And I don't think that God is a being. I think God is a force and God is a power. Okay. And I think that anything that higher power created, it created multiple types of living organisms and multiple types of living beings. Okay. The man and the woman represent one of these living organisms or being that was set to live on the earth. When you think about the term autochthonous or indigenous, it means one who sprung forth from the soil. Now, we know when we read in Genesis, it talks about how Adam, or the original man and woman, was formed or fashioned out of the material substance of the earth, and a living spirit or a soul was placed into that being. And that's where you get the original man and woman. And from these original men and women procreating and multiplying, that's where you get us today. So do I think that the original humans, the original man and woman, the original bronze, copper color complexion people of the earth, do I think that they came here on a spaceship from somewhere else? I do not personally think that. I'm actually more in alignment with the definition of autochthon, meaning one who sprung forth from the soil. I can't fully explain to you maybe how that happened, but I do believe that the original man and woman sprung forth from the soil, and a living soul or a living spirit was placed into that man and woman who sprung forth from the soil. And I believe that the highest power, Almighty, has something to do with that. I don't believe that we were created from some other living being that was created themselves. Because the story about the Anunnaki, these are just living creatures or living beings or living organisms from somewhere else in, let's say, the cosmos or the galaxy, but they are created too. Something created them. So when I talk about the Most High or the highest power, I'm talking about the Alpha and Omega. I'm talking about the highest power was not created by anything. The highest power created everything. And the highest power is responsible for the life and the soul power that all living organisms have. That's the source that our living essence comes from. It comes from this highest power. So the Draconians and the Anunnaki, they were created by the highest power, just like the man and the woman was created by the highest power. So you have different types of living beings, let's say, throughout creation. So these Anunnaki and these Draconians, I believe that's what they are. And I also think that when it pertains to the Anunnaki or the Elohim, because that's another term, they may be related to the original human being. So the original man and woman of the earth, the first autochthonous man and woman of the earth, the original copper-colored person of the earth, they may have a genetic relationship with some of these living beings that were created by the highest power. There may be a genetic or a bloodline connection naturally. Okay. Now you ask, well, Blackbeard, why do you think that? Well, I know that in Genesis it says, let us make man in our image. All right. Now, what we do know is that, let us is plural. And we also know that the highest power has no form. Okay, so the highest power, the Most High, is not one of the Anunnaki. And I also do believe that just like the Bible talks about the angels work on behalf of the highest power, and when something needs to be done, the angel will show up and do the bidding of the highest power. Maybe when it came to the fashioning of the original man and woman of the earth, maybe there were certain angelic beings or progenitors that were given instruction on helping, let's say, form the original man and woman. I'll just leave it at that. And that may just be the physical body and the physical part of us. But as far as our soul, as far as our spirit, as far as that higher power that's within us, that really is animating us, that entered into our mother's wombs, and that will exit and leave our physical body when we're done here, that spiritual being was not created by the Anunnaki. That is from the highest power, Almighty itself. Okay? So I don't think that a real soul or a real spirit can be created by something in creation. I do not. All right. Now, as far as how the Anunnaki fit in this, as I said, I think that some of them may be related to the original human. All right. It may be like a distant cousin or something like that. I do, because I don't think that the original man and woman of the earth, I don't think that we are the only living beings in the cosmos or in creation. There are other intelligent living beings that could even be humanoid that are part of creation. And let me say this too. When I talk about the Anunnaki, I'm talking about a humanoid type of being. I'm not talking about something that doesn't look like us. All right. Now, I don't agree with everything that this man puts out, but when you look at some of the images that the man, Dr. Malachi York, had some of his artists draw when they were just trying to illustrate and depict how maybe some of the Anunnaki or some of these original humans may have looked, I do agree on how he makes them look like so-called black people. Okay. So I don't believe that they, don't look like us. Maybe they don't, you know what I'm saying? Because I've never seen them. But from taking in Genesis when it says, let us make man in our image, and also how I know that the highest power, Almighty, is a power and a force. The highest power, Almighty, is not a so-called black man or a so-called black woman. But whatever the angels are, I do believe that they are melanated beings. Now, whether you want to call them so-called black men or black women, that's up to you. But I do believe that whatever we call the angels or the Elohim. I do believe that these are melanated males and females. I'll say that. Okay. Now it moves on to say, also, how do the Draconians and Anunnaki fit into this, considering you mentioned they are connected to Yakub scientists in America? All right. So we read about the Yakub story, which, is talked about in various cultures in a variety of ways. The term Yakub is just an archetype name. All right. And I believe that it's an archetype name and an archetype person and an archetype group of people who may either have been original humans, or they may have been something related to the original human that had a negative objective. I'll say that. Okay. I believe that the term Yakub is dealing with either original humans or is dealing with something related to the original human that had malefic intention, that had a malefic objective. All right. That had an insidious objective. Now, when you read about the Anunnaki, it'll talk about how that they constructed a being to basically provide free labor and slave labor for them. Let me say that one more time. When you read about the Anunnaki, one of the things you're going to come across is that the Anunnaki may have created a being for the sole intent of it providing slave labor to them. All right. Now, personally, that sounds a lot like the Yakub story. Okay. Because when you read the Yakub story, basically some of the intent that Yakub had was to create a being that was going to be subservient to him or them. Okay. And to provide free labor. Now, as I said, the highest power Almighty was responsible for the original man and woman who sprung forth from the soil and placing a living soul and a living spirit inside of the original human. Okay. But I've also and always questioned the Neanderthal, or what they call the quote unquote caveman. All right. When I look at the Neanderthal or the caveman, I don't come to the conclusion that it is from the original human family and it is from the original autochthonous people who sprung forth from the soil. I do not think that. I do not. I think that the Neanderthal or the caveman, I think that it's a hybrid of original humans and something else. Okay. So I believe that the Neanderthal or the caveman, it is an alternate creation. I don't believe that the highest power Almighty maybe have directly created it. Maybe it did. I don't know. But it's just kind of hard for me to, see why would a being that is so totally different from the original human, like, for example, the original humans on the planet, we all don't look the same. But one thing for certain is that we all do have those bronze earth tone complexions. So if you go into the woods or the woodlands in Southeast America, North America, in the South during the fall season, an original human can actually camouflage with the woodland, with the woodland territory and the woodland landscape. Okay, we come in these various shades of brown, brunette, bronze, copper colored. We have certain types of hair texture. We have certain type of phenotype appearances. OK. Like in the Bible, it talks about the antediluvian survivors, Noah and his sons. And it talks about how all of humanity that's living today comes from one of these progenitors that were Noah's sons. But what I know is that Noah and his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, these men descended from the original humans of the earth. So they were all of the copper colored, indigenous complexion. Copper colored, bronze complexion, indigenous original group of humans. They descend from them. So what I'm saying is that so-called Ham, so-called Shem, and so-called Japheth, they were all so-called black men. Okay. They were all so-called black men. They just came from different ethnic progenitor lineages. All right. So some of us may be Shemitic, some of us may be Hamitic. So let's take the so-called African and let's take the so-called Black American. Using biblical terms, the so-called Black American comes from a Shemitic line, and the so-called African comes from the Hamitic line. So we don't come from the same ethnic lineage or bloodline, let's say. But as far as the phenotype and how we look and our appearance as humans, it's not too different. Think about it. Moses, who was a Shemitic man, lived amongst Mizraim or the Egyptians, and they were Hamitic people, and he was able to blend and disguise with those people, so much so to where he thought he was Hamitic. And all through the Bible, you will come across various, indicators that show that the Shemitic and the Hamitic people, they look similar, because the Shemitic people will often go into Hamitic civilizations and blend in. All right. So what I'm getting at is that the original men and women of the earth that descended from Adam, or that original group, that original autochthonous group, we all have those earth tone complexions. The Neanderthal or the caveman looks totally different. He looks totally different. He looks like he may have been genetically linked to the original man and woman of the planet, but there's also something else in his genetics as well. Is it animal DNA? I don't really know. Or is it some DNA from another living organism or living being that we may not know about? Possibly and probably. So when it talks about the Anunnaki and the Yakub scientists, that's what they're referring to. They're referring to this alternate creation that was either in the antediluvian world or the post-flood world, where you had a created being, meaning either a human being or maybe an interdimensional being from somewhere else, but something that was part of the creation. And it had a malefic intent, and it wanted to create its own being. So it's no different than today, how you have human beings, and today we create artificial intelligence. We create robots, androids, etc., right? But the human being is of a higher intellect. It created and gave life to the android or the artificial intelligence. Okay, no matter how sophisticated or advanced it is, it still was created by something that was higher than it. So the same way that us human beings today create androids, I believe in the antediluvian world that the original human beings or some created being is responsible for the drafting and the creation of the Neanderthal. I do. Because when we refer to the Yakub phenomenon, in my mind, I think the Neanderthal. Okay? I think the Neanderthal. I know a lot of us may have a tendency to jump all the way to the modern day Caucasian man and woman that you see today, or what you call so-called white people. All right? You got to understand that so-called white people or Caucasians, in 2024, they have much more human DNA than Neanderthal DNA. And the reason why is because they've been mixing with original humans for a couple of thousands of years now. They haven't intermixed with all bloodlines, but for the most part, they've been intermixing. In particular in Europe, Northwest Africa, and the so-called Middle East. So most Caucasians that are United States citizens that, live in North America, they have ancestors from Europa, Caucasian ancestors from Europa. But most of their ancestors, believe it or not, were intermixed with the melanated people of Europa, because the original ancestor of the Caucasian is also known as the wild man or the wild woman of Europa. And when you look up the wild man and the wild woman of Europa, it looks like a Caucasian, but it looks like a more ancient version of the Caucasian. It looks like a less human version of the Caucasian. Or in other words, it looks like a version of the Caucasian that doesn't have as much original human genetics to make it look like the phenotypes that we see today. So I believe personally that, and I'm going to wrap it up with this, I believe that the way that so-called Black Americans look in 2024 AD, we look the same way in 2024 BC And we also look the same way in 20,024 BC. So I believe that the way the original man and woman looked, Adam, we look the same way today. The original human, the original man and woman who's only been procreating with each other looks the same way today that we did millions of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago. But when it comes to the Caucasian, I believe that the further back you go, their ancestor looks less human. And the original ancestor that they have is what we call that Neanderthal and wherever it came from. And I believe it came from a mixture of original human and we'll call X. You know how in algebra you got to solve for X? I don't know what the X is. I don't know if it was primate. I don't know, I don't know what it was. It could have been animal DNA. I don't know what it was. But whatever it was, there had to be a scientific marriage to get the human DNA and the foreign DNA to come together to create this brand new being that we call the Neanderthal or the caveman. It didn't naturally, it's not a natural being, basically is what I'm saying. It's not a natural phenomenon. All right. It's not. Just like the color purple. The color purple is the marriage of the color red and blue. All right. So that's where you get purple from. If there's no red and blue, there is no purple. So what I'm saying is that there is no Neanderthal if there is no original human and whatever that original human was genetically spliced with. Okay. So I hope I provided some clarification on these, subjects because they can be confusing. And as I said, this is an ongoing study. All right. So just be patient with yourself and continue to do your research and do your due diligence. But salute, love to the people. Stay tuned. We out.